By the spring of 1945, the collapsing German Reich had begun pulling boys as young as 14 into uniform. Historical military records from the U.S. National Archives show that by March and April, entire units of the Volkssturm and Hitlerjugend were made up of teenagers, many carrying rifles they barely knew how to use. These boys were not trained soldiers but frightened students pushed into the front lines as Germany's defenses crumbled under the Allied advance. In those final weeks, the fighting across Western Europe had become chaotic. American units advancing through the Rhineland routinely encountered pockets of young German fighters, some still in school clothing, others wearing oversized uniforms. According to post-war testimonies later published in various POW memoir collections, many of these youths had been told by Nazi instructors that American troops would torture or kill any German soldier who surrendered. For this reason, many boys hesitated to lay down their weapons, even when surrounded. One such group of young fighters was captured near a small village west of Cologne. American infantrymen reported that the boys, exhausted and terrified, carried more fear than hostility in their eyes. The U.S. Army had strict procedures for taking prisoners, especially minors, and field reports show that soldiers were instructed to prioritize medical checks, disarmament, and immediate separation from adult POWs when possible. For the captured teenagers, the first moments after surrender were filled with confusion. Many expected violence because that was all they had been told to expect. Yet instead of punishment, they were met with calm instructions, food rations, and blankets. One former youth POW later recalled in an oral history project that the American soldiers seemed tired and human, not the monsters we had imagined. This reaction was common among young prisoners who had been raised on years of wartime propaganda. The boys were gathered in an improvised holding area, usually an open field or farmyard, and processed according to Allied regulations. U.S. military policy required that child POWs receive medical evaluations, and historical medical records confirmed that many were malnourished, suffering from influenza, or weakened after months of food shortages caused by the collapsing German supply lines. As the boys were moved toward larger collection centers along the Rhine, they witnessed scenes that would mark the end of the world they had known. Burned farmhouses, abandoned German vehicles, frantic civilians searching for relatives, and the constant rumble of Allied convoys heading deeper into the heart of Germany. The collapse of the Nazi government had created a vacuum. No clear orders, no functioning communication, no structure. To these young prisoners, it felt as if everything familiar had dissolved overnight. Eyewitness accounts preserved in post-war archives consistently describe the same emotional pattern. First, disbelief. Then, a sense of shame mixed with relief. And finally, a quiet realization that the war, at least for them, was over. Many of the boys were too young to fully understand the political catastrophe unfolding around them. They only understood hunger, fatigue, and fear. The American guards who escorted them across temporary bridges and past checkpoints often offered small gestures. Cigarettes to older prisoners, chocolate or chewing gum to the younger ones. These moments appear again and again in documented testimonies. For many of the boys, it was the first time they questioned the truth of what they had been taught about the outside world. By the time they reached the larger POW assembly point, the young prisoners were no longer expecting execution or beatings. Instead, they wondered what would happen next. Rumors spread quickly that they might be sent to France, that they could end up in America, that the war would end any day. None of them could imagine that within weeks, they would board ships crossing the Atlantic. For now, captured on the soil of a collapsing homeland, they were simply boys, hungry, confused, and unsure of who they were without the uniforms forced upon them. After their capture, thousands of German POWs, including minors, were moved through a network of Allied collection camps along the Rhine. According to U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps records from 1945, America had begun transporting large numbers of prisoners overseas because European camps were overcrowded and unstable. Many of the boys did not know this. They believed their processing was temporary and that they would soon be released or relocated within Germany. No one imagined a transatlantic voyage. When the order finally came, the prisoners were loaded onto open-bed trucks and taken to larger transit points near Antwerp, Le Havre, or Cherbourg ports heavily used by the U.S. military. Former POWs later recalled in interviews archived at the Bundesarchiv that the trip to the coast felt surreal. They had never traveled so far from home, and now they did so as captives. Columns of destroyed tanks, burned-out houses, and streams of displaced civilians lined the roads. Every passing kilometer was another reminder that the world they knew had collapsed. Upon reaching the port, the boys saw enormous American troop ships and Liberty ships, vessels they had only heard about through wartime propaganda. Many were astonished by their size. U.S. Army Transportation Corps documents show that POWs were boarded under strict supervision. Identification checks, medical screenings, disinfection procedures, and the issuing of basic supplies such as blankets and tin cups. For the young prisoners, these preparations felt overwhelming. Few had ever been on a ship, let alone one bound for another continent. The atmosphere aboard the vessels was tense but organized. Testimonies collected in post-war POW memoirs consistently describe the same first impression. The overpowering smell of diesel, the cramped sleeping quarters, and the constant hum of engines. The soldiers guarding them were often older American reservists, men who had no interest in cruelty and simply wanted the war to end. Their calmness confused many of the boys, who had been raised on warnings that Americans were brutal and merciless. Life on the Atlantic voyage followed a rigid routine. The prisoners were divided into groups, assigned to specific decks, and given scheduled times for meals and limited fresh air breaks on the upper decks. According to U.S. Navy guidelines for POW transport, minors were to be kept separate from high-risk adult prisoners whenever possible, and guards were instructed to intervene quickly if fights or intimidation occurred. Many boys later remembered how unexpectedly orderly the journey felt. Nothing like the frightening scenarios they had been taught to expect. The ship rolled constantly in the spring seas. For some of the young Germans, seasickness was worse than fear. Navy logs from 1944 to 45 mention that medical staff frequently treated nausea, dehydration, and anxiety among prisoner groups unused to ocean travel. Yet small gestures also lingered in the memory of the young POWs. An American medic handing out aspirin, a guard offering chewing gum, another showing a photograph of his own children as if to remind the boys that he, too, wanted to go home someday. During quiet moments, the prisoners gathered along the railings, staring at the endless gray water. Many later described this as the moment they realized they were truly leaving Europe, leaving everything familiar. Rumors spread constantly. Some believed they were being sent to labor camps. Others thought they might be exchanged or held only until the war ended. A few feared they would never return home. None of them fully understood America's POW policy, which required humane treatment and eventual repatriation once hostilities ceased. For the youngest prisoners, the voyage became a strange mixture of fear, curiosity, and reluctant calm. They listened to the distant music from the American crew's quarters, watched seagulls disappear as the ship moved farther from shore, and felt the cold Atlantic wind on their faces. Bit by bit, the old propaganda began to lose its grip. They were still captives, but not in the ways they had imagined. When the coastline of North America finally appeared on the horizon, distant, faint, and almost unreal, many of the boys stood silently at the railings. None of them had ever dreamed they would see this place. Their journey across the ocean, something unimaginable only weeks before, had become the defining passage between the world they came from and the world they were about to enter. As the ship neared the American coastline, the young German prisoners gathered along the port side, drawn by the excited whisper spreading through the lower decks. According to multiple POW interviews archived in the U.S. National World War II Museum and the Bundesarchiv, the first sight of America was often described as unbelievable, peaceful, and shockingly different from everything we were taught. These boys had been raised on years of Nazi propaganda insisting that the United States was a land of criminals, poverty, and violent chaos. Nothing in their upbringing prepared them for the reality approaching across the waves. Their first sight was not a war zone, but the distant outline of a calm shoreline, industrial docks, wide harbors, and rows of buildings standing untouched by bombs. For many German youth POWs, this was the first moment they understood that the war had never reached American soil. U.S. Army Transportation Corps records confirm that ships typically arrived at ports such as Boston, Newport News, or New York, where busy civilian workers continued their routines with little attention to the incoming POW transports. As the ship entered the harbor, the boys watched cranes load cargo, women drive trucks, and American workers laugh among themselves. Scenes entirely different from the starving, exhausted Europe they had left behind. Some prisoners, recalling the moment decades later in oral history recordings, said they were stunned by the abundance. The clean docks, the modern equipment, the steady flow of food crates and fuel barrels. They had been told America was collapsing under corruption. Instead, they saw efficiency and stability. When the POWs disembarked, they were surrounded not by hostility but by strict, orderly procedure. The U.S. Army Military Police, following guidelines outlined in the 1944 War Department POW Manual, processed the prisoners calmly. Identity checks, medical evaluations, delousing, and registration. The guards rarely shouted. Most spoke with the detached professionalism of men performing routine work. For the young prisoners, this simple respect was disarming. Many later admitted that this moment shattered the last pieces of propaganda they had believed. What surprised the boys most was the reaction of ordinary Americans. Civilians on the docks glanced at them with curiosity, not hatred. Some simply continued their tasks without interest, treating the arrival of German prisoners as just another part of wartime life. One youth POW later recalled in a recorded interview, "We expected anger. Instead, people looked at us the way you look at workers leaving a factory shift." This emotional neutrality was more shocking than hostility. The boys were then loaded onto trains, typically old but well-maintained Pullman cars adapted for military transport. The journey inland revealed even more contradictions to what they had been taught. They passed through quiet towns with white-painted houses, large farms with healthy crops, and streets full of cars. More cars than some German boys had seen in their entire lives. Wartime rationing existed, but America still possessed a level of prosperity unimaginable in Europe. Many youth POWs later spoke about this moment as a turning point. They saw grocery stores with full windows, children riding bicycles, and families walking freely without fear of air raids. The U.S. government's own reports from 1945 noted that POWs frequently expressed astonishment at the normalcy of civilian life. One prisoner wrote in a post-war memoir that the journey from the East Coast to the interior felt like traveling from one world to another. Along the rail lines, some Americans waved at the passing trains. A few tossed apples or newspapers toward the cars. Small gestures that left a deep impression on boys who had grown up believing Americans were vicious. These gestures were often remembered decades later, mentioned in interviews as the first signs that kindness existed beyond national boundaries. When the train finally approached the POW camps, usually located in rural areas of Texas, Iowa, Kansas, or the Midwest, the landscape continued to surprise the prisoners. The camps were fenced and guarded, but they were far from the brutal prison complexes described in wartime rumors. Reports preserved by the American Red Cross and the International Committee of the Red Cross confirm that conditions in U.S. camps met or exceeded the requirements of the Geneva Convention. Adequate food, medical care, exercise areas, and even access to libraries or classes. For the young German POWs, their first day in America was a collision of expectations and reality. Everything they had feared proved false. Everything they had assumed about the outside world dissolved in the face of ordinary life, calm order, and humanity. By the time night fell on their first day in the United States, many of the boys lay awake in their bunks, no longer terrified but deeply confused. The world they had imagined was gone. A new one, entirely unexpected, had just begun. When the train carrying the young German prisoners finally slowed and stopped, the boys expected harsh labor sites, barbed punishment yards, or the brutal compounds they had heard about on the Eastern Front. Yet, according to U.S. War Department POW camp inspection records, most American camps were built not as punishment centers, but as controlled, self-contained communities intended to comply with the Geneva Convention. As the teenagers stepped onto the dry soil of the Midwest or the open fields of Texas, they realized immediately that this was not the nightmare they had imagined. The first thing that surprised them was space. Unlike the cramped holding areas in Europe, American camps stretched out across wide farmland. Rows of wooden barracks, well-maintained kitchens, infirmaries, recreation fields, and work areas. Red Cross inspections from 1944 to 45 describe U.S. camps as clean, orderly, and sufficiently provisioned. For boys who had grown up under bombing raids, ration lines, and the scarcity of late-war Germany, the openness felt unreal. Their first meal inside the camp shocked them even more. Former POW testimonies collected in the U.S. National Archives repeat the same detail. The food was good, far better than what many Americans themselves were eating under wartime rationing. Plates of beans, bread, potatoes, and occasionally meat were served in large portions. Some youths later admitted feeling ashamed as they realized American guards were receiving rations only slightly better than the prisoners themselves. The camp routines were strict but humane. Morning roll call, work assignments, exercise periods, and scheduled free time were all regulated by the War Department's POW manual. Younger prisoners were often assigned to lighter duties, kitchen work, groundskeeping, or agricultural labor for local farms under supervision. Agricultural work became one of the defining aspects of POW life. Records from state agricultural boards confirm that German prisoners helped replace American farmhands who had gone off to war. Many farmers later recalled that these young Germans worked hard, grateful for the sense of normalcy. For the boys, the work outdoors felt strangely liberating. They were still prisoners, watched by U.S. guards, yet they walked under open skies, spoke freely, and handled real tools instead of rifles. One former youth POW, interviewed decades later, described it as the first time since the war began that life felt like life again. Inside the camp, the atmosphere was surprisingly educational. Under Geneva Convention rules, the U.S. allowed prisoners access to libraries, language classes, and even vocational training. Money earned from farm labor, paid in camp coupons rather than cash, could be spent on small comforts. Soap, stationery, chocolate, or books. Red Cross reports note that many youth POWs eagerly joined English classes, not out of admiration, but out of curiosity, and because it made the days pass more easily. What confused the young prisoners most was the behavior of the guards. Many were older Americans, farmers, teachers, small-town men serving in the military police. They enforced rules firmly, but they did not treat the boys cruelly. Some showed small acts of kindness, sharing newspapers, explaining local customs, or letting the younger ones see photographs of their families. These gestures chipped away at years of propaganda. The boys also noticed something else. Americans debated openly. Newspapers available in camp, though censored for sensitive military content, still showed political arguments, letters from citizens, and criticism of public policies. For youth raised in a totalitarian state, this openness was astonishing. One POW later remarked in an archived interview, "We saw disagreement without fear. That alone was unbelievable." Even entertainment reached the camps. Visiting chaplains offered services, local musicians occasionally performed, and some camps showed films on weekends. Ironically, these were the first American movies many German boys had ever seen. Films they had been told were dangerous, immoral, or corrupting. Instead, they were simply stories. Yet, the strangest feeling of all was psychological. They were prisoners, but they had more safety and food than they had known in years. Many youth POWs described this paradox in their later memoirs. How captivity in America felt, in some ways, like a release from the fear and chaos that had dominated their lives in Nazi Germany. At night, the boys lay in their bunks inside warm barracks, listening to distant trains and wind sweeping across the fields. The guards made their rounds. The fences stood firm. And yet, for the first time in a long time, the boys felt the absence of war, the silence, the routine, the small but undeniable hints of freedom within captivity. It was a strange freedom, yes, bounded by wire, ruled by foreign soldiers, far from home. But for many, it was the first place in years where they could breathe. For many young German POWs, the first full day in an American camp marked a turning point that would echo through the rest of their lives. The shock of arrival, the unexpected kindness, and the calm organization of the camp challenged every belief they had been taught. According to post-war testimonies stored in the Bundesarchiv and American oral history collections, this single day often reshaped their understanding of the world more profoundly than any lesson they had received in their homeland. On the morning after arrival, the boys awoke to a sound they hadn't heard in months. Quiet. No artillery, no air raid sirens, no frantic orders shouted by exhausted officers. Just the steady movements of camp staff beginning their routines. Red Cross reports describe U.S. camps as remarkably stable environments, designed to keep prisoners healthy and productive. For teenagers raised in a collapsing Germany, this predictability felt astonishing. After roll call, the young prisoners were escorted to breakfast. Once again, the generosity of the portions surprised them. Many memoirs mention the same detail. American kitchens served oatmeal, eggs, bread, milk, and sometimes fruit. To boys who had survived the famine-like conditions of late-war Germany, such meals felt unbelievable. Later interviews reveal that some grew emotional, realizing that their captors were feeding them better than their own government had during the final months of the war. During orientation, interpreters explained camp rules, work programs, and Geneva Convention rights, freedom to worship, access to mail, the ability to participate in education and sports. For many youths, hearing these rights read aloud was the moment everything shifted. They had lived under a regime where rights were conditional, where loyalty dictated treatment. Yet here, even as prisoners, they were guaranteed protections simply because they were human beings. That first day also brought their first real conversations with American guards. These were not the brutal, vengeful figures described in Nazi propaganda. They were ordinary men, farmers, factory workers, fathers. Some spoke a little German. Many made an effort to speak slowly in English so the boys could understand instructions. Oral histories preserved in the U.S. National World War II Museum show how deeply these interactions affected the young POWs. One recalled, "He treated me like a boy, not an enemy soldier. That changed everything." Work details were explained that afternoon. Younger prisoners were assigned light labor, sorting tools, repairing fences, or assisting in camp gardens. For many, the idea of productive, peaceful work felt almost therapeutic. U.S. agricultural records show that youth POWs were often praised for their discipline and efficiency, traits drilled into them during years of Hitler youth training, now redirected toward ordinary, harmless labor. It was the first time some of them felt useful without violence attached. Letters from home were also introduced as part of daily life. The Red Cross facilitated correspondence, though mail was slow and heavily censored. Still, the idea that they could write to their families from thousands of miles away gave many boys a sense of connection they had not expected. Survivors later said that the ability to send even a few lines back to Germany helped them understand that captivity did not mean disappearance. Perhaps the most powerful change came from simple observation. As the boys watched American civilian workers enter and leave the camp freely, maintenance men, drivers, Red Cross visitors, they saw a society functioning without fear. The newspapers available in camp, though reviewed by censors, still contained open political debate, criticism of officials, and discussions about civil rights. For youth who had only ever known propaganda, this was eye-opening. Scholars studying POW experiences often point to this exposure as a major factor in the political transformation many prisoners later described. That night, as the boys returned to their bunks, they carried a mixture of confusion, relief, and awakening. They had arrived expecting torment. Instead, they found structure, education, food, and an unexpected dignity. Many later recalled lying awake, replaying the day in their minds, realizing for the first time that everything they had believed about Americans, about democracy, freedom, and the enemy, had been built on lies. In countless interviews conducted decades after the war, former youth POWs repeated a similar sentiment. "My first day in America changed my life. It was the day I stopped seeing enemies and started seeing people." For these boys, that first day did not erase the trauma of war, nor did it diminish the longing for home. But it planted something new, an understanding of a world beyond ideology, a sense that respect could exist across borders, and a belief that their future did not have to be defined by the past.